You need to leave, Julia. My father said it plainly, standing shoulder to shoulder with his new wife in the foyer of my own home. He said it like he was stating the weather, like he wasn't handing down a life sentence from a bench he had no right to sit on. Kayla stood beside him, a silent statue of approval, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. My eyes just slid past them, landing on the keyring by the door. Those keys hung on the same wrought iron hook where I'd looped the strap of my pink backpack every day after second grade. The metal was worn smooth in places from 1,000 touches. My fingers remembered the shape before I even moved. I walked over, the floorboards silent under my feet, and took them. The cool weight settled into my palm. He didn't stop me. Kayla didn't flinch. The soundtrack to my eviction was the thumping bass from the garage, where her son, Ashton, was lost in his own world, and the faint, chirpy echo of a TikTok audio from the study her daughter, Maddie, had colonized. They were a whirlwind, scrubbing away the traces of me. But in their haste, they overlooked the foundation. The deed. The legal, typed truth on paper that bore my name and mine alone. So I left. But not because he told me to. I left because a plan, cold and clear, had just clicked into place in my mind. It was time to reclaim what was mine. My father, Logan Mitchell, was a quiet man. He spoke through actions, through the things he built that were meant to endure. He bought this house when I was 10. It wasn't a home then. It was a lament of peeling paint, a roof that wept, and a yard choked by neglect. Most saw a money pit. Dad saw a promise. This house just needs someone to believe in it, he'd said, his hand resting on my shoulder. Even then, I sensed he was talking about more than wood and nails. He built that belief, weekend by weekend. He taught me to swing a hammer so the nail went in straight, to caulk a window against the draft, to nestle geranium roots into soil with care. We weren't just repairing a structure. In the quiet after my mother's death, he was constructing a sanctuary for us both. By 16, my hands were as familiar with paint primer and sandpaper as they were with schoolbooks. We restored the staircase banister until the oak gleamed. And in a hidden spot on the shed wall, he carved our initials, LM plus JM House Builders, he'd call us. A house stands if it's truly cared for, was his motto. I thought he meant maintaining the gutters or shoring up a beam. I didn't yet know he meant the people inside it. When my acceptance letter to Boulder for civil engineering arrived, his pride was a tangible force. This house will be yours one day, he promised, and this time he made it official. A year after graduation, over Sunday pancakes at our kitchen table, he slid a folder toward me. The property title. Sole owner, Julia Mitchell. I want you to have it, he said, his voice thick. Not because I'm going anywhere. Because you've earned it. I hugged him, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and coffee, believing that piece of paper was just a formality. A symbol of his love. I never dreamed I'd have to wield it as a weapon. I never imagined the day would come when I'd have to fight for the very walls I helped raise, with my own father standing passively beside the people trying to tear them down. But that day had arrived. And I was done being quiet. I met Kayla at my father's 60th birthday party. Her perfume arrived a moment before she did, a cloud of something sharp and floral. She laughed with a startling volume at jokes that didn't deserve it, her hand perpetually resting on Dad's arm. I performed my duty, a polite smile, a offered glass of wine. She clasped my wrist, her fingers cool. Oh, sweetie, you're just as pretty as your pictures, she cooed. Your father talks about you so much, I feel like I know you already. My smile felt brittle, glued in place. I didn't know her at all. A month later, her suitcase was in the foyer. The transformation was subtle, then absolute. First, the living room. Dad's beloved. Dog-eared history books vanished from the shelves, replaced by decorative orbs and scented candles that smelled of rain-washed linen. The fridge slowly purged itself of orange juice, making room for rows of green kale smoothies. The television remote began a permanent game of hide-and-seek. I bit my tongue. Because Dad hummed while making coffee. He'd started whistling again. He hadn't done that since before Mom died. His happiness felt like a fragile bird I dared not disturb. Then the reinforcements arrived, Ashton and Maddie, Kayla's adult children from a previous life. At 21 and 19, they were far from kids. They were fully formed planets entering our orbit, with their own dense gravity and a sense of entitlement that comes from a lifetime of being told they were the center of the universe. Ashton communicated in grunts and door slams, his world mediated by noise-canceling headphones. His main contribution to household discourse was a relentless complaint about the Wi-Fi speed. Soon, the garage, my father's garage, the site of swing repairs and first birdhouses, echoed with the sound of his voice testing microphone levels. He was building a podcast studio. When I voiced my unease, Dad just offered a weary shrug. He needs a creative outlet, Julia. The word stung, as if the outlet hadn't been built by our own splintered, paint-stained hands. Maddie was a different kind of invasion. She claimed the guest room and declared it a blank canvas. The soft, buttery yellow Mom had painstakingly chosen was buried under a coat of impersonal gray. A harsh, neon ring light appeared, casting everything in a clinical glow. Once, passing her open door, I caught her midstream, voice sugary for her followers. My stepsister is such a snooze fest. Honestly, zero aesthetic. The label was a fiction. We were not family. We were occupants in a Cold War, and they hadn't bothered to learn the rules of engagement. Kayla masterminded the campaign with a smile. Oh, Julia, you know how creative souls are. Such a mess, she'd sigh, waving a hand at the chaos. Then, the knife, always delivered with gentle concern. You're so accomplished now. A successful woman like you must be dreaming of a place that's all her own. Each time she said it, the words carved a little deeper. Because this was my own. I paid the property taxes. I unclogged the gutters each fall. The physical deed with my name typed in bold black ink lay in the desk drawer upstairs. Yet, with every disappearing coffee mug and every new, gaudy pillow, I felt myself shrinking, fading into the background, a ghost in the only home I'd ever had. The erasure was a process of 1,000 small cuts. It began with the mugs. The chipped, silly, glorious collection Dad and I had gathered from every road trip and roadside attraction vanished from the cupboard. Kayla declared them too shabby for guests. In their place stood a uniform army of beige ceramics inscribed with generic commands: live, laugh, love. A hollow mantra for a hollowing home. Then came the formal annexation. Ashton taped a hand-scrawled "keep out" sign on the garage door. The space where we'd repaired bikes and built bookshelves was now a sanctum, soundproofed and sealed. I found my father's well-oiled tools dumped in a rusty bucket in the corner. When I asked Ashton to please put them back on the proper hooks, he didn't even look up from his mixing board. Chill out. They're just collecting dust. The lie was a physical blow. I used those tools. Every spring, I found peace in the rhythm of Dad's lathe, restoring a piece of furniture, feeling connected to him through the work of our hands. That bench held the ghost of every project we'd ever shared. Maddie's conquest was more flamboyant. Mom's reading nook, a sun-drenched alcove that still held the echo of her laughter, was transformed into a TikTok studio. The bookshelves were gone, replaced by a tinsel curtain and a blinding ring light. A vanity littered with products sat where Mom's favorite armchair used to be. One morning, instinct pulled me to that door. I opened it and Maddie spun, a look of pure irritation on her face. Privacy much, she snapped, before shoving the door shut, the lock clicking with finality. Kayla later patted my arm. She's just expressing herself, honey. It's creative. To me, it was a violent rewrite of history. But the true acid eating at my heart was my father's complicity. He nodded along to Kayla's redecorating schemes. He forced a chuckle at Ashton's crude jokes. He helped Maddie shift the living room sofa for the 10th time, chasing the perfect content lighting. He was a willing ghost in his own life. I finally cornered him in the kitchen, my voice barely a whisper. Dad, I don't feel at home here anymore. He couldn't meet my gaze, focusing instead on scrubbing a spotless counter. Julia, please. They're trying. They just need a little time to settle in. Time. They were consuming it, along with everything else. They hadn't earned a minute of it. Our rituals died quietly. The Sunday morning garden checks, the fixing of the third step from the top that always groaned, The shared silence over roof inspections, all gone. Replaced by the hum of Kayla's yoga app, the bass thump of Ashton's live streams, and Maddie's music blaring not for joy, but for ambience. I retreated. Friends were no longer invited. I worked later, parked my car down the block, and braced myself before walking inside. They weren't just occupying the house, they were performing ownership, and with every performance, my role shrunk from heir to intruder. They mistook my silence for surrender. They confused my observance with weakness. In their campaign to claim what was never theirs, they overlooked the single, immutable fact that underpinned it all. They forgot the name typed on the foundation stone of this entire mess. Mine. The final act arrived on a Sunday morning, the last thread of the week I still, foolishly, thought of as ours. I came downstairs late, clinging to the hope of a few moments of quiet. The house throbbed like an open wound. The floorboards hummed with the sub-bass from Ashton's podcast studio. Maddie practiced a dance routine in the hallway, her phone propped against the wall. Kayla's voice carried from the living room, a loud, performative monologue about blackout curtains and accent pillows. I moved through the noise toward the kitchen, a sleepwalker seeking coffee, seeking any familiar anchor. And then I saw it. The refrigerator door, once a chaotic tapestry of my childhood, crayon suns, lopsided houses, A-plus spelling tests held by fruit-shaped magnets, was wiped clean. Sterile. In the center, a pristine whiteboard declared in Kayla's meticulous script, "The Mitchell family." I was frozen before this official rewrite of history when my father entered. He wouldn't look at the fridge or at me for long. "Julia," he started, his voice a careful, rehearsed thing. We need to talk." He barreled forward, not waiting for a reply he clearly didn't want. "We've been thinking. A young, independent woman like you should have a place that really reflects your success. Your strength. You've got your whole future ahead." The words, meant to sound empowering, were hollow and tinny as they left his mouth. I felt the world narrow to a cold, sharp point. "This is my home." His eyes darted to the doorway, where Kayla had materialized, arms folded like a satisfied general. She offered a thin, tight smile. "Well, it's our home now, sweetie. Right?" On cue, Ashton leaned in from the hall, his tone one of exaggerated reason. "It's just logistics, Julia. For adults, one house. It's cramped. You'd thrive in your own space." I blocked them all out. My gaze locked on my father, the man who taught me how to hold a level. "Is this," I asked, each word clear and slow, "what you want?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. He did not speak. He did not move to my defense. He simply studied the dark swirl of his coffee as if the answers were written there. Something settled inside me, a final, irrevocable click. I walked to the hook by the door, the metal cold under my fingers. I took the spare keys, my keys, and slipped them into my pocket. The weight was a promise. I looked at the three of them, a united front of erasure. "Okay." Kayla's smile bloomed, triumphant. Maddie let out a gleeful little clap. Ashton snorted. "Wow. That was easier than I expected." They thought my okay meant surrender. They believed the quiet daughter would simply fade away. But they had forgotten the core, central truth. I did not require their permission to depart. And they possessed not a single legal right to remain. I did not slam the door. I did not scream. I did not grant them the drama of a final look. I walked out into the morning sun, got into my car, and drove with a steady calm directly to the one person who dealt in the truth they'd chosen to ignore, my lawyer. The air in Isabella Carter's office was cool and carried the scent of old paper and sharp intellect. I hadn't seen her since the day, years ago, when she'd notarized the title transfer with a warm, congratulatory smile. Now, she regarded me over the rims of her reading glasses, her expression turning from professional concern to steely understanding as she opened the file. Her eyes scanned the top document, landing on the clear, typed truth, Julia Mitchell, sole owner. She looked up, a flicker of something like grim satisfaction in her gaze. "Well," she said, closing the folder with a soft thump. "It appears they've made a catastrophic miscalculation." The next 2 hours were a cathartic exercise in forensic accounting. We documented everything. Every property tax receipt I'd paid from my own account. Every utility bill in my name. Maintenance invoices for the roof, the gutters, the furnace. I produced faded letters from my father, his handwriting stating plainly, "The house belongs to Julia." I described the violations: the soundproofed garage, the desecrated reading nook, the vanished heirlooms. Ms. Carter listened, her pen tapping a steady rhythm, nodding as I laid out the blueprint of my own displacement. "Don't you worry," she stated, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "Legally, they are squatters with an invitation. They don't have a leg to stand on." Revenge was a cold concept that held no warmth for me. I didn't want to punish them. I wanted my sanctuary back. I wanted the silence of my own walls. So I embraced a different strategy: perfect, patient quiet. For the ensuing weeks, I continued to visit the house. I became a ghost, a silent witness. I would stand in the doorway of the garage and watch Ashton use my father's cherished workbench as a mere table for his energy drinks, drilling into its edge without a second thought. I observed Maddie staging photo shoots in the living room, turning it into a backdrop for her personal brand. I saw Kayla at our kitchen table, swatches of eggshell white paint spread before her, planning the final, bland coat over my family's history. I answered their occasional, dismissive questions with monosyllables. I offered polite, empty smiles. And all the while, my phone camera was a silent archivist. I documented every change, every arrogantly placed belonging, every act of ownership they performed. I took a close-up of the shed door, where the faint, ghostly shadow of our carved initials LM+JM was all that remained in the sanded smooth wood. They mistook my silence for surrender. They read my non-confrontation as defeat. Ashton's smirk grew more permanent, Maddie's performances more brazen, Kayla's tone more proprietorial. They were celebrating a victory. I was preparing for a reconquest. By the beginning of the third week, my dossier was complete. Ms. Carter had done her part. In my hands, I held three things: a fat folder of irrefutable evidence, a fresh, certified copy of the deed, and a formal, legally binding eviction notice. 14 days. That was the sum total of the time they had left to occupy the home they had tried to steal. The quiet was a lie. The storm hadn't passed. It had been brewing, gathering its strength in the low pressure of their assumption and my silence. On a Tuesday afternoon, with the sun shining blandly, I delivered the truth. I walked up the familiar path, the eviction notice crisp in its envelope. No doorbell ring, no confrontation. I simply bent and slid it across the threshold, the official seal of Ms. Carter's firm facing up. The bold, uncompromising text was clear: "You have 14 days to vacate the premises." I turned and walked away. I didn't need to see their faces. The reaction would find me soon enough. It took 5 hours. My phone screamed with Kayla's name. Her voice was a shard of broken glass, all pretense of sweet concern obliterated. "How dare you? After everything we've invested here. The love, the work." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting the torrent of accusations and fabricated history wash out. We saved this place. Ashton modernized the garage. Maddie injected life into these dreary rooms. I waited for the pause, the gasp for air. My reply was clinical, detached. All unauthorized alterations. Each one has demonstrably decreased the property's market value. Before she could summon another wave of fury, I ended the call. The second call came 3 hours later, the number one I knew by heart. My father. The line held only the sound of his shaky breath for a long moment. "Julia, you're really going through with this?" My voice didn't waver. It was the steadiness of stone. "You stood beside them while they dismantled every piece of mom. Every memory we built with our own hands. I begged you to see it. You chose not to listen." A heavy, worn-out sigh traveled down the line. I'm not angry. I'm just so tired, honey. With Kayla. I don't feel so alone anymore." The confession was a small, sad poison. And with them, I said, my own weariness showing, I watched our home become an empty, echoing void. The calm ended the next morning. The war they thought they'd won abruptly declared itself lost, and all hell broke loose. I knew the battle had escalated before I even turned onto my street. My front lawn, once just grass and Mom's long-gone peonies, was now a stage for public martyrdom. A cluster of people from Kayla's church stood in a loose circle, holding placards aloft like spiritual picket signs. "Family over property," one declared. "Honor thy father," demanded another. As I parked and got out, a woman with a tight, pious smile detached herself from the group and marched over. She didn't introduce herself. She simply looked me in the eye and pronounced, "Your mother would be so ashamed of you right now." The words were meant to be a killing blow. Instead, they hardened my resolve into something diamond-hard and cold. So this was their moral high ground. Noted. Inside, the scene was chaos. The house they'd tried to claim now looked like a ransacked outpost. Cardboard boxes formed teetering towers. Maddie was sobbing dramatically into her phone's camera, her live stream viewers undoubtedly receiving a performance of epic victimhood. Ashton prowled the perimeter of the living room, a tiger trapped in a cage of his own making. And my father, he moved like a ghost through the mess, picking up a book only to set it down again, a man utterly lost, unsure whether the script called for packing a bag or waiting for a director to yell cut. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. Ashton positioned himself in the archway to the hall, blocking my path. His earlier smirking confidence had curdled into raw, entitled fury. "You don't understand anything," he spat, the words hot and sharp. "We built something here. Our lives are here. You can't just toss us out. We improved this place. We added value." I didn't raise my voice. I simply raised my folder, the thick, legal repository of their transgressions. "Would you like a detailed accounting of the value you subtracted?" I flipped it open, holding a photograph directly before his eyes. There was Dad's workbench, its surface a battlefield of deep scratches and lurid paint spills, a vice handle snapped clean off. I switched to the next, the kitchen wall, now a jarring, neon pink. Then the final piece of evidence, the shed door, the smooth, blank wood where our joined initials had once been a proud, permanent declaration. Ashton's bluster evaporated into a stunned, impotent silence. Kayla was next. Employing a different tactic. She approached with her arms folded, shaking her head with a theatrical sadness, as if scolding a toddler. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper meant only for me, yet loud enough for my father to hear. "Julia, think. Maddie's pregnant." She gestured, and on cue, Maddie stepped into view, hands cradling the small, round swell of her belly beneath a short sweater. "She needs a stable home. Do you truly want to be responsible for uprooting that?" I felt, rather than saw, my father stiffen beside me. A flicker of his old protective instinct, horribly misdirected. He said nothing, a pillar of silent conflict. My voice was low, measured, cutting through the staged drama. "I gave you a home. Months of shelter with no rent, no bills, no responsibility. And in return, you tried to erase every history that wasn't your own. You didn't just live here. You gutted its soul." The hallway was quiet, save for Maddie's sniffles. I looked at each of them in turn, the furious son, the weeping daughter, the calculating wife, the silent father. "You have 4 days remaining," I stated, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I suggest you use the time to pack." On the final day, I arrived with reinforcements. Miss Carter, a silhouette of professional authority in a tailored suit, stood beside me. A locksmith with a heavy metal case and a man from a bonded moving company, his expression neutral, completed the party. We were not a mob, we were an execution of order. The driveway was a clogged artery of their departure. Kayla presided over 2 designer suitcases on the sidewalk, her face a perfect mask of affronted dignity. Ashton leaned against a porch column, his glare hot enough to scorch paint. From the open passenger door of an overloaded Jeep, the sound of Maddie's choked sobs cut through the morning air. My father emerged last. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. His eyes were fixed on the pavement, carefully avoiding mine. He didn't offer a farewell, didn't attempt a final plea. But as he shuffled past, his hand brushed mine, and a small, folded square of paper was pressed into my palm. The touch was fleeting, a ghost of all the times he'd handed me a tool or steadied my hand. I didn't open it until their last car had turned the corner. The note was written on the back of a grocery receipt in his familiar, looping script. "I was blind, but you weren't." I'm sorry. The tears didn't come then. They waited until the new key turned in the lock, until I crossed the threshold alone, and the heavy front door swung shut behind me, sealing me into the silence. The air inside was a strange, foreign cocktail, cloying lilac aerosol battling the greasy ghost of fried food. They had taken anything not bolted down. The curtains were stripped from the rods, leaving the windows naked. Mom's terracotta planters, the bookshelf with its spine cracked from use, even the delicate wind chimes that used to sing from the porch eaves, all gone, scavenged. But they couldn't take the bones. The solid floor under my feet, the lines of the walls, the skeleton of the home I helped build, it was all still here. And the silence. It was immense, profound, and utterly mine. No thudding bass line, no electronic beep of a ring light powering on, no dramatic footfalls on the staircase at all hours. Just the settling of the old wood, the hum of the refrigerator, and the weight of memory. My feet carried me first to the garage. It was a hollowed-out shell. The pegboard, with its perfect outlines of missing tools, was gone. The floor was swept clean, every trace of sawdust and oil and projects past eradicated. It was a blank slate, an insult to its own history. But I remembered. I could still see the glint of a nailhead under a hammer strike, feel the Saturday sun through the open door, hear his patient instructions over the whir of the drill. In that empty, echoing space, surrounded by what they had taken and what they could never erase, I knew where to begin. The healing began with a phone call. I rang Mr. Tucker, my father's old friend who ran the hardware store and whose hands were as familiar with wood grain as my dad's once were. He arrived within the hour, no questions asked, carrying a dented metal toolbox and a thermos of what he called motor oil coffee. We didn't talk much. We just got to work in the hollowed-out garage, our focus on the wounded workbench. Together, we wrestled the vise back into its proper alignment, its jaw tightening with a satisfying, familiar squeak. We pried off the warped shelf Ashton's speakers had ruined and cut a new one from a plank of maple. It wasn't a perfect restoration. The scars of their occupation, the deep scratches, the paint splatters remained like battle wounds. But it was functional. It was honest. It felt right. The following week, I declared war on the neon pink kitchen. Armed with a scraper, gallons of primer, and a blistering playlist from my teenage years, I scrubbed and rolled and covered. With each coat of primer, the aggressive pink faded, a phantom slowly being exorcised. When I finally brushed on the first stroke of soft sage green, the exact color Mom had chosen, it felt like a homecoming. While moving the stove to cut in at the edges, a small, stained rectangle fluttered to the floor. One of her recipe cards for lemon bars, the ink faded, the corners softened by time and grease. Her handwriting was a punch to the heart. That was when the dam broke. I sank to the floor, the paintbrush still in my hand, and sobbed for all of it, for her, for him, for the stolen piece. When the tears were spent, I wiped my face, tucked the cards safely on the windowsill, and kept painting. The reclamation became my ritual. I fixed the chain on the porch swing until it swayed without a groan. I hauled the heavy, dark drapes Kayla had hung to the curb, letting the sunlight stream in unfiltered. From the depths of the storage closet, I rescued our old bookshelf, dusting each shelf with reverence. And I brought Mom's rocking chair back from its exile in the corner, placing it in its original spot where the afternoon light would catch it just so. It was more than a cosmetic shift. The space was beginning to breathe a familiar air. I was beginning to breathe again, too. There was no word from Kayla, Ashton, or Maddie. The silence from their quarter was a gift. But the mail brought another communication from my father. A plain envelope with no return address, containing a single photograph. In it, I'm 11, grinning a gap-toothed smile, my face smudged with dirt, struggling to hold a framing hammer that seemed as big as my arm. On the back, in his now achingly familiar script, he had written, "You always knew how to rebuild." I forgot. I didn't know what to do with the apology, but I knew what to do with the memory. I bought a simple frame and placed the photo on the mantel, a testament to the girl who learned how to build, and the woman who was forced to remember how. The house was not yet whole. A sense of peace still felt fragile within me. But with every drawer I slid back onto its runners, every stair tread I polished to a soft gleam, I was reclaiming more than square footage. I was reclaiming history, purpose, and a version of myself I had almost surrendered. Last weekend, the house received its first true guest. My 8-year-old niece, Ellie, arrived, a whirlwind of sharp questions and boundless energy, her smile featuring a charming gap between her front teeth. She burst through the door, raced down the hallway with her arms flung wide, and declared, "Aunt Julia, you have the biggest house in the world." I laughed, not at the exaggeration, but from a deep, quiet place of certainty. For the first time in so long, the thought resonated without a shadow of doubt. Yes, it is mine again. We baked muffins in the kitchen. She perched on the counter, legs swinging, as I showed her the old trick for testing if the oven is hot enough, the same trick my father taught me at her age. Later, we curled up with books on the porch swing. Her small hand smoothed over the arm of the rocking chair. "It's really old," she observed, "but it's so shiny." I smiled. "It belonged to someone very special." She nodded, satisfied, and snuggled deeper into her blanket. She loved that room. I found, to my surprise, that I truly loved it again, too. She didn't press for more details. The feeling of the place was enough for her. That night, I tucked her into the bed in the guest room, its frame now smooth and solid after hours of my own sanding and stubborn repair. As she drifted off, her voice was a sleepy murmur in the dark. "When I grow up, I want a house like this. Not a cool one, just one with stories in it." I stood in the doorway for a long time, her words settling around me like a blessing. That was it, exactly. This house was a story. A narrative written in layers of paint, whispered by squeaky stairs, documented in the faint pencil marks under the windowsill that tracked my height every birthday. Not everyone gets to defend their story. Not everyone is granted a second chance to reclaim their narrative. I was given that chance, but the currency was high. A fracture with my father that may never fully mend. Relatives who fell silent, their judgments hanging in the air. Some think I was cruel. Some argue I should have sacrificed principle for a false peace, let Kayla remain, let Maddie's roots dig in. But I have learned that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is surrender. And family is not defined solely by blood or marriage. It is forged in respect and sacred memory. I never aspired to be the villain in their tale. The thought of causing my father pain is a cold stone in my stomach. But I had to honor the man he once was, the father who chose me, who signed the deed, who carved our initials into wood as a permanent covenant, who leaned down and whispered, "One day, all this will be yours." Now it is. Not just as a line on a legal document, but in the reality of every scrubbed baseboard, every wall restored to its rightful color, every morning where the sunlight patterns the floor in a way I remember from childhood. I may never recover the relationship I lost with him, but I can and I will rebuild this house. And one day I will pass it on not as mere real estate, but as a testament. A place where strength took a stand, where memory was defended tooth and nail, where one woman looked at what was being stolen and softly, firmly, said enough. Because sometimes, to be painted as the villain in someone else's story is the only way to remain the hero of your own.